Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Far Cry 5 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. What you're seeing here is the PC version. This is a first-person shooter and the follow-up to Far Cry Primal, although it is more the successor to Far Cry 4 than anything else, and it was developed and published by Ubisoft in March of this year for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. And generally speaking, it was very well received across the board, although it did receive a fair bit of criticism from certain political and religious groups who seemed to think that the antagonists were a direct comment on them. Although, ironically, if you actually play the game, it kind of goes out of its way to avoid any sort of real social commentary. Anyway, additional criticism was directed mainly at the game's endings, which I'll get to more when I get to the story, and I will definitely be giving you a spoiler warning when I talk about that. But suffice to say, let's go ahead and start delving into the game proper and find out what exactly we're dealing with here and how it holds up. Well, as far as presentation goes, this does run on the latest version of the Dunya engine, and it is definitely a very good looking game for the most part, particularly with regards to the environments, which are absolutely gorgeous in this thing. It's obvious they did a lot of research and they put a lot of time and effort into making the environment look and feel like Montana, and it pays off massive amounts in the game. But it's not just the environments. When you go into the cutscenes and it has a lot of close-up interactions with the various characters, they've done a fantastic job with the facial animations and the lip syncing, and making sure these characters look like they could be real people. When you're actually running around and doing stuff in the main parts of the game, however, it's definitely lower quality, but it's still very solid nonetheless. Now that said, even though they've done a fantastic job with most of the visuals, there are a few issues here and there. For example, there are glitches in the game, but that's kind of to be expected in an open world title. And there are some issues here and there with certain animations, certain textures, that sort of thing. For example, when you're reloading the lever action rifle, you don't reload it correctly. You have to actually chamber around, not just eject the spent casing and then just stick a bunch of rounds in the tube. It doesn't work that way. But that's really the only kind of thing you can complain about with the visuals. For the most part, they've done an excellent job. It's just bits here and there are mildly annoying, and that's definitely not enough to cause any real issues. Then you move over into sound design, and things also are very solid there. The sound effects generally work rather well, although I would have liked a bit more oomph in the weapon and explosion sounds than they have here. Instead of being really bassy and concussive, they're just decent. And then you move over to the music, and you have a very solid soundtrack for the most part, with the style of music changing depending on which region you're in to reflect which cult member rules that particular section. You end up with a mixture of country, rock, gospel, and even other genres out there, and there are also a mixture of licensed tracks thrown into the mix as well to give it a bit more authenticity, and it ends up being a pretty decent soundtrack overall, although I could certainly do without the country music, but anyway. Then you move on to voice acting, and you find that pretty much every single character in the game is very well voiced. The characters that tend to be more ridiculous are certainly voiced that way, and the direction is such that it ends up working out well. And of course the characters that are meant to be more serious end up doing their job very well on top of that. So you end up with a very strong mixture of sound elements, and when you bring that together with the visuals, you have ultimately a very strong presentation, although there are a few issues here and there. But of course what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as a deputy of the fictional Hope County, Montana, and you're simply known as the Rookie, or Rook as the sheriff refers to you. And you start out the game as part of a task force that is going into the main complex of the cult known as the Project at Eden's Gate in order to arrest their leader Joseph Seed on charges of abduction with intent to harm. Things go horribly wrong after he offers no resistance, and members of the cult attack the helicopter that you're trying to exfiltrate on and end up taking it down, rescuing Joseph, and then they initiate their process known as the Reaping, which is a campaign by the cult to either convert who they can, or if they can't convert them, to kill anybody who gets in their way of what they see as bringing salvation. Which is to say that they are rounding up all of the members of the cult and trying to herd them all into fortified bunkers to wait out what they see as the collapse of civilization. You manage to escape the initial cult attack and end up getting the help of a guy named Dutch, who tells you what's going on and basically sends you off to hook up with the various resistance groups that are fighting the cult in 3 different areas of the county, each of which is currently controlled by the cult and is being overseen by one of the 3 siblings of Joseph Seed, which are Faith, John, and Jacob, all of whom have different functions that they oversee in the cult. Faith oversees the production and distribution of the hallucinogen known as Bliss, which the cult uses to control its members as well as to try to win people over to their cause, while Jacob oversees the rather brutal training of the cult's armies, and John oversees not only acquiring land for the cult, which they've managed to buy up most of Hope County at that point, but also the forcible conversion of people over by cleansing them, in air quotes, of their sins by torturing them. And your job is pretty straightforward. Go into each of these regions and take every single one of them down. And taking down the 3 regional leaders will return the control of that particular region to the people of the county, as opposed to being under the thumb of the cult, and you ultimately work your way towards taking down Joseph Seed himself. And the game actually does a surprisingly good job of keeping you motivated in liberating the county from this horrible cult, because the people of the county itself are actually very likable characters for the most part. Sure, some of them are pretty one-note and often rather ridiculous, like, say, Herc, but the vast majority of them are people you can relate to on at least some level. They have a sense of community, that they don't want to be destroyed. They're fighting for their friends and their family and their homes and what they believe in. There's people who, sure, they might have just wanted to be left alone, but they're just not gonna sit idly by and let the county tear itself apart because of this crazy cult. They're gonna stand up against them too. And the general sense you get from all of that is that even though things are a horrible mess right now, they're ultimately gonna get better. And that's really the most compelling part of the narrative, but unfortunately, it's also completely opposed to the actual narrative of the game. This is where I have to get into some spoiler territory, so if you haven't finished the game and you don't want the ending spoiled for you, then I'm going to put up a warning right now telling you where you can skip to in order to get past the spoilers here. But for those of you who don't mind spoilers, let me go ahead and continue. The main issue with the actual story is that it is ultimately at complete odds with what you are doing the entire game. As I mentioned before, throughout the entirety of the game, there's this general sense of optimism that once you kick the cult out, things will not necessarily be the same, but you'll ultimately come out of it and things will get better over time. It is constantly telling you how full of crap the cult is, that it has this extremely nihilistic, fatalistic worldview, where they are just absolutely convinced that the world is going to end soon, and if you don't let them, quote, save you, unquote, that you'll just ultimately be destroyed along with everything else, and they're the only ones who will ultimately survive and repopulate the world. And the entire game goes out of its way to show you that these people are completely insane. They're either not in the right state of mind simply because they use the bliss so much, or they are just so brainwashed by the cult's teachings that they have no grip on reality. They are completely insane, and you should not trust anything they say. And so you spend the entire game thinking that way until you finally get to the ending, and they completely collapse the floor out from under you. You see, there are 3 endings, the first of which is a secret ending at the very beginning of the game, much like with what you saw in Far Cry 4. Only instead of being kind of a neat Easter egg and, oddly enough, a neat character moment in Far Cry 4, here it's almost like the game is just kind of winking and nodding at you, because you walk away with the grim realization that if you arrest him there, then nobody's walking out of that camp alive. And you would likely come out of that ending going, well, that was anticlimactic and very dumb, and it's certainly the case. But here's the problem. That's the good ending. The other 2 endings are much, much worse. The first of them is that Joseph gives you a choice at the very ending of the game, and depending on what you choose, you'll get one of the other 2 endings. The first of them is that he allows you to simply walk away, and you can certainly take that choice. You do that, you go off and you get into a vehicle and you drive off with your remaining companions, and they say, well, we're gonna go get help now. Only some music starts coming in on the radio, which you've been brainwashed to earlier in the game, and it activates your kind of crazy kill state. So ultimately, you end up being brainwashed by the cult in that ending. And in the other ending, you choose to fight back against the cult, you regain all of your companions, and you manage to take down the rest of the cult, and you're down to Joseph Seed. You arrest him, and right when you're about to haul him off, a mushroom cloud appears in the distance, and it turns out that Joseph Seed was right all along. It is the game telling you that every single thing you have done up to that point, every single character you have interacted with, every single bit of that rather optimistic worldview that everybody was sharing up to that point was not only pointless, but was outright wrong, that you were wrong to fight against this whole thing all along. It ultimately creates an obnoxious no-win scenario that is just downright insulting to the player. If it were, say, a more bittersweet ending, but still having optimism and hope for the future, that would be much more fitting with the actual narrative that preceded it, but instead, it sweeps the rug out from under you and basically laughs in your face, saying you were a fool for trying. So, like in war games, it ultimately ends up being a strange game where the only winning move is not to play. And to make matters worse, if you try to avoid the story and focus entirely on the gameplay, then it laughs in your face too, because it forces you to play through story missions. Completing various tasks gradually builds up a meter that shows you how close you are to kicking the Overseer out of a particular region, and there are certain milestones within each bar. So those will get you to a point where they're sending more powerful enemies after you, or they start having air patrols instead of simply having ground patrols, or things like that. But here's the thing, at every single one of those milestones, you get captured. No matter where you are, and no matter what you're doing. You could be right in the middle of a friendly base, and all of a sudden, you'll collapse and wake up in the clutches of whatever that particular enemy is. And it will not let you go back to doing the various open world shenanigans you were having fun with until you've completed those story missions. So basically, the game sits there and very frequently slaps the controller out of your hands and says, no, 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 stop having fun, it's story time now. It is an incredibly obnoxious way of handling storytelling, and it becomes extremely irritating extremely quickly. So even well before the garbage endings happen, the actual story has probably irritated the living crap out of you several times by that point. So you probably don't care so much about the story and you just want to play the friggin' game. And really, that's where it actually shines. When it lets you play the game, it's actually quite a bit of fun. It doesn't really take itself all that seriously on the gameplay side of things, and even a lot of the writing isn't very serious for most of the game. It's just when you're actually going into the main story, it takes itself so deadly seriously that it just gets on your nerves. Meanwhile, you go on the various side missions and you're doing all kinds of wacky stuff with Herc. There's a mission where you collect one of your companions who is a pyromaniac, and you're given a flamethrower, a bunch of effectively zombie cultists, and Disco Inferno starts playing, so you know exactly what you have to do there. There's a side mission where you wander onto the set of the Far Cry Blood Dragon movie, and you end up having to keep the set quiet by mowing down the cultists in the area who are making too much noise for that director's tastes. Hell, 3 of your companions are animals. One's a dog, one is a mountain lion, and the third one, which I think is the most amusing, is a diabetic grizzly bear named Cheeseburger. It is a game absolutely full of completely ridiculous scenarios that are just plain fun. And it's constantly shoving its garbage story in your face, preventing you from enjoying the things that actually are fun. It's just plain insulting. And even if you somehow manage to summon the fortitude to get past all of that, and you start focusing on the actual gameplay, you find that you're mostly just enjoying the mayhem and you're enjoying the completely ridiculous scenarios that are set up more so than the actual mechanics. That's all mostly unchanged since Far Cry 3, and even though it is decent enough with some fairly satisfying gunplay in the sense of all of your weapons doing quite a bit of damage, but this is offset by generally fairly poor AI that's really not capable of giving you much of a challenge at all, and some occasional bullet sponge enemies that are similarly not challenging at all, it's just that they have more health than the other enemies. You can still do takedowns, chain takedowns, and sidearm takedowns, although I found the sidearm takedown to be rather finicky and didn't work all the time, so your mileage may vary on that. And of course you do have a couple of different ways you can accomplish the scenario. You can either be really sneaky, or you can run in guns blazing, or you can do a combination of the two, with both styles being pretty effective in the long run. So at least in terms of gameplay, it's what you've come to expect of Far Cry since Far Cry 3, so it's very familiar, but when it did launch, there was a noticeable lack of content compared to previous entries in the series, which they've been kind of expanding over time with the addition of 2 DLCs, as well as some additional updates that added in a few new weapons and such here and there. They've also tried to spice things up with live events that only happen for a limited amount of time, and then a new live event gets triggered later on, but those are usually only slight modifications of the things you're doing in the game anyway, so it doesn't really matter all that much in the long run. Beyond that, there's an additional game mode called Far Cry Arcade, which allows for custom scenarios made through the editor, as well as these various scenarios that Ubisoft made themselves, and those give you different parameters, different loadouts that you can play around with, and can mess around with scenarios that are completely removed from what's going on in the main game, and can be utterly insane. And while it can spice up the game a bit, ultimately it's rather limited as to what you can actually do in the editor, and the actual quality of the levels that you're going to be playing are determined entirely by who's making the level at any given point. And obviously, the vast majority of levels are going to be complete crap because people are just messing around with the editor and don't really know what they're doing. But even the well-designed levels are just that. They're levels. They're rather brief sections and they don't last very long, so that kind of wears thin pretty quickly. And if you try to go into the multiplayer, you find that it's really bare bones and is not very fun. Certain weapons are noticeably overpowered in the multiplayer, and on top of that, it runs on peer-to-peer, so whoever is hosting the match is going to have an advantage, and everybody else is going to be a bit laggy by comparison, and on top of that, the chance that you're going to have just a ridiculously laggy game in general is very high. So the multiplayer is pretty much a complete bust, although you do have full co-op in the campaign, so if you want to hop into the campaign and play it with your friends, you can certainly do that. And in the testing I did of that, it actually worked rather well, so if you were looking for a co-op game, then this can certainly fit the bill if you can get past all the other issues that it has. But you do have to keep in mind, even if you do play the co-op, all of the problems that plague the single-player campaign still affect the co-op too. It's just that now you're playing it with a friend instead of just playing it alone. And to make matters more annoying, the campaign progress is not reflected on your own individual campaign as you play on somebody else's match. So for example, if I have a friend join my co-op game, then my game will continue progressing, but if he goes back and plays his game on his own, then he finds that he's wherever he was before he joined my co-op session. So that can be a bit weird and annoying, particularly if the game you join is pretty far ahead of yours. So they didn't handle the co-op particularly well, but it is functional, so if you want to play the game co-op, it's certainly an option for you. But ultimately, when you bring Far Cry 5 together as a complete package, it just ends up being something of a mess. Individual elements might work here and there, and when the game lets you play it and just lets you run around and do stuff, it can be rather fun. But as absolutely terrible as the writing is, and as absolutely infuriating as it can be when it's constantly shoving those story missions in your face, it just kind of renders any amount of fun you're having moot. And it's a real shame, because you can tell quite a lot of effort went into certain aspects of the game, and it does have its moments, but they're relatively few and far between, and it just ends up leaving you with a general sense of very heavy disappointment. Now before I completely wrap up the review, there are 2 DLCs I want to talk about, but I honestly don't have a huge amount to say about either one of them. And I have absolutely nothing to say about the 3rd DLC, which isn't out yet, but I'm not going to bother taking a look at because it is not remotely up my alley. So let's go ahead and talk about what those 3 DLCs are and what they introduce to the game. So the 3 DLCs, which are included with the Season Pass, are Dead Living Zombies, which is the one I'm not taking a look at, and you can probably gather why just from the title, as well as Hours of Darkness, which is a Vietnam War DLC, and Lost on Mars, which is pretty much what it sounds like. It is worth noting that Dead Living Zombies is not out yet, but even if it were, I still wouldn't be taking a look at it just because I have no interest in a zombie DLC for this thing. But I will be taking a look at, in release order, Hours of Darkness and Lost on Mars. So let's go ahead and start with Hours of Darkness. Hours of Darkness is the first DLC released for Far Cry 5, and it takes you over to the Vietnam War, where you play as a guy going under the call sign of Python, and your helicopter is shot down while you're on a mission scouting anti-aircraft emplacements, and you manage to escape capture by the Vietnamese only to be instructed to get to the extraction point, which means that you're ultimately going to have to track down all of your squad mates and free them before making it to the extraction point, and that's pretty much all the DLC really is. Along the way, you'll be taking out enemy commanders and anti-aircraft batteries and rescuing prisoners of war, but other than that, you're dealing with a DLC that's primarily centered around stealth. It gives you various perks that you unlock as you continue to do stealthy actions, and as long as you stay stealthy, those perks will continue to be effective. But the thing is, you don't really need those perks because stealth in the game is very easy anyway, and since the enemies are really dumb like they are in the base game, and the weapons are so damaging like they are in the base game, you can pretty much just run in and mow them down without any issues. The DLC does take itself pretty seriously as well, although since it is really short and it doesn't have any of the ridiculous amounts of interruptions that the main campaign does, it ends up really not being a problem, because you can deal with a serious campaign as long as it's relatively short and straightforward, like what you see in this particular DLC. You do get a smaller environment to run around in than what you see in the base game, and it is relatively open, but you're dealing with a pretty narrow valley, and there's not really any proper open world content to speak of here, so it just ends up being a pretty linear, story-driven DLC that is decent enough for the roughly 2-ish hours that it will keep you occupied. That said, it's definitely not worth the price they're asking for its standalone, because it is only about 2 hours long, and they're wanting $12 for it, which for a DLC for a game like this is really quite wimpy. Especially when you compare it to its follow-up DLC, which costs only $10 and is about 3 or 4 hours longer. So as far as Hours of Darkness goes, if you like the base game, then you'll probably like that DLC. In fact, you might like the DLC a bit more than some of the main game, at least in terms of being pretty much uninterrupted Far Cry gameplay. But it's nothing really all that special, and I definitely cannot remotely recommend picking it up for full price. Only get it if it's on sale for really cheap, or if you get it as part of the Season Pass. This leads me into the second DLC that was released for Far Cry 5, which is Lost on Mars, a considerably sillier DLC than Hours of Darkness that is also longer. As I said, it's about 5 or 6 hours long depending on your difficulty and how much you spend just wandering around doing aimless things. And it has you playing as Nick Rye when he receives a communication from his best friend Herc, who tells him that he really needs his help, and ends up beaming him to Mars, where he finds out that Herc has been completely dismembered and is now a floating head that is needing to regain his body, and also helping an AI called Anne fight off an alien invasion of Earth by reactivating a series of facilities that will allow her to rebuild her robot army and fight off the arachnid horde. You can probably see exactly where that's going. It's a very predictable plot right from the start, but it's kind of meant to be. This particular DLC is meant to be something completely absurd and just downright silly for the most part. I mean, Herc is constantly being his typical Herc self the entire time you're running around, and he is your sole companion for the entirety of this DLC. But the thing is, that's kind of the only thing the DLC really has going for it, because Herc is constantly making stupid comments and silly jokes the entire time, and Nick is continually staying exasperated by it, but the actual content of the expansion consists of 2 different types of missions. The first of them is the main story missions for that DLC, which are activating various facilities to power and backup, and the second is going on the various side missions to find all of Herc's body parts. And while the latter are considerably sillier because they have Herc being Herc the entire time, the former are insanely boring, because it's towers all over again. Because clearly the pinnacle of entertainment is to hop up a pathetically easy platforming challenge in low gravity and press a button at the top. But the sad part is, even the other missions, the ones where you're going to find Herc's body parts, or even the other side content that's in this particular DLC, all is still busy work. This is a DLC where literally the entirety of it is all of the filler content that you see in the main campaigns of the Far Cry games that you're just meant to go and do for about 5 minutes and then go back to doing whatever you were doing that was actually fun. Sure, they try to spice things up a bit by telling you not to walk on the loose ground, because if you walk on the loose ground, that will summon arachnids to your position and you'll have to fight them off, whereas if you run on the rocks, then they can't detect you and you can just move around around freely, and they spice up the weapon variety a bit by making all of the weapons have infinite ammunition but overheat over time, with major distinctions being things like your basic rifle is just a rapid-fire but low-damage weapon, whereas your first shotgun fires bolts that will actually bounce off of surfaces, and that sort of thing. It all still becomes extremely stale extremely quickly. And while the DLC's sense of humor certainly helps a bit, it doesn't help anywhere near enough, and it just makes the Lost on Mars DLC not worth bothering with at all, really. So ultimately, the DLC for the game is extremely disappointing, much like the main game, in fact, and it's just not worth the price of admission, even if you get it with the Season Pass. So that really just leaves the main game on its own, and I simply can't recommend it. It's too much of a mess, and the story itself is just so irritating and insulting that it's really not worth bothering with in the long run at all. That's not to say that it doesn't have some fun moments here and there, but there's just so much more of the game that is incredibly irritating that I just can't really recommend it. I give it a 2 out of 5. Thanks for watching.